right, you know what? Lisie and Alicia, let's get started because it's 4:02 and people can join in as they end. And of course, we're going to be recording. So anyone who signed up but is not here will get the recording. My name is Meredith Jacobs. I'm the CEO of Jewish Women International. Welcome to the next in our series of masterclasses for nonprofit leaders. We are going to be talking today about the relationship between the board and nonprofit staff. And we have two extraordinary experts today to share with us. They'll open up the conversation, frame the issue, but then I want this to be interactive. Please either raise your hand or drop a question in the chat. I'm thrilled to introduce Lisie Gottdenker, who is the current vice chair and executive committee member of the JCC Association board. She is the former board chair of the Bender JCC, and I was honored to serve under her as a member of that board. And I can tell you she is an unbelievable unbelievable chair. And I must say, interesting to see how she navigated COVID, leading an organization that's so important to the Jewish community and yet was also struck so hard during the pandemic. Alicia Oberman is the vice president of Leading Places to Serve at Leading Edge. She was also the founder of Boardified that then merged with Leading Edge. And both Lisie and Alicia were honored by JWI as Women to Watch this past March. So Lisie and Alicia, I'm going to turn it over to you both.
Thank you, Meredith, for that very kind introduction. And we are going to actually keep this somewhat informal, especially given the group size. And we want this to be as interactive as possible. So just a couple of quick points of interest for us. And if you can have your cameras on, that would be awesome. If you can't, we understand that people are multitasking and that can be a challenge. So we totally get that. But I will be asking some questions, so raising hands and things could be helpful. The first thing I would ask that you do is, so I like to know, we like to know who's in the room, meaning because you can see connections and all of those types of things. If you wouldn't mind, and we're not going to go around and introduce ourselves, but at least put in the chat where you live and what organization you are affiliated with, whether it's or board you serve on, whether you serve on multiple boards, if you serve on 5 boards or whatever it is, just pick 1 or 2. And obviously, if you're a staff member as well, where you are, just so we can get a sense of who's in the room. So that would be awesome. Good modeling, Meredith. Thank you. Awesome. And while we are doing that, I'm going to open this up and ask the first question of our esteemed board member guest. And I have a couple of questions, like I said, prepared, but really this is more about having your questions answered and taking this home for you, both from a board and staff perspective. And I want to recognize that we have both in the room, and so we will be looking at it from different angles depending. We will each take different sort of sides of the coin, so to speak, depending on the question. But if there's something more applicable or specific you'd like us to get into, for now the rules will be raise your hand, put it in the chats, etc., or just come off of mute. If it becomes too unwieldy, that's a problem we love to have, and we will put in more formal rules should that be necessary. So I will start with a fairly broad question for us to take on, and then we'll move from there. So Lisie, in all of your board roles that you've been on, what would you say are the key characteristics of an effective board-staff partnership?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you again to Meredith for having me and Alicia for being my co-person on this call today. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm really hoping that you all feel like this is time well spent for you. I think that a couple things are really important when you talk about the board-staff relationship. I think the most important thing to remember as a board member is that it's about the agency or it's about the organization. It's not about you. And so if that is how as a board member you represent yourself and how you make decisions and how you move forward, that relationship will definitely be easier, because by and large, it has been my experience that most staff people that are working at these agencies really do care deeply about the mission of the agency, as normally do board members, but not always. And so having that understanding that it's about the organization and not about you is a very important quality to making that successful. And then really even, in the same sort of level of importance is it's a partnership. It's not one over the other, it's a partnership. And there needs to be a level of respect and understanding that goes both ways.
So what are some of the ways that you've seen that partnership, especially say at the board chair or the senior leadership pieces, cultivated? Like what are actually different methodologies, different ways, and your maybe preferences of trying to cultivate that partnership?
I'm sorry, board chair to board member of the same board, or?
I would say, sorry, board chair to senior staff.
So I think the first thing that you really want to do is, if you are a board chair, you've obviously chaired committees. And I think really all roads really start with being committee chairs, because if you are a committee chair, those are really the people that are working most closely, usually with senior staff, to make things happen. And I think it's really important that you start out, whatever your year is, your fiscal year, or before whatever it is that you're going to embark on, and sit down and have a very clear understanding of what the expectations are for both of you, what the goals are, and who is going to be responsible for what, and who is not going to be responsible for what. Because I think that understanding as a board member what you are not responsible for is super important, and will make your staff, this staff person's life infinitely easier. And again, I can't say this often enough. It's about respect, and it's about patience, and about open lines of communication, and really going back and forth and having the open lines of communication is very important.
Absolutely. So I think the strand there that I'd love to pick up on a little bit, and pick on, I guess, is the roles, right? Everyone asks, one of the things that everyone, seems to come to me are like, what are the roles of the board and what are the roles of the staff? And I think there are clear delineations. And again, if people have more specific questions, let me know. Clear delineations between the board roles operating at an accountability and strategic level, right? And the staff that is really operational. So just as a reminder, the board has one and only one employee, right? And that is a CEO/executive director. They hire, fire, manage, provide accountability for that particular individual and nobody else. I want to make sure we understand that to be important. We can talk about gray lines in a minute in terms of staffing, budgeting, like things like that. And I'm going to ask Lisie in a second to talk about sometimes where that grays, but that is, a clear line that there's only one person that reports to the board. End of story. And I think it's important. And I also want to point out too, equally important to that reporting is also the evaluation, management, accountability, all of those things. If you look at our recent, Leading Edge does a CEO report every year, at least for the last 4 or 5 years. And we are definitely falling down in the Jewish space as it relates to providing accountability and meaningful feedback to our CEOs. And I think that's something to note. And that is probably one of the questions I most get asked is, how do we review a CEO, even though the CEO has been in that position for a number of years? So I just want to make sure, I know that might be obvious to a lot of people on this call, but I always feel the need to sort of reiterate that point. So Lisie, going back to the board roles and the staff roles, and I'm gonna get a little bit more complicated here. I think in my observation is that in COVID times, right, these lines tended to blur, right, from the operational and the strategic, like what is operational and what is strategic. And I'm wondering, like, especially with your involvement in the JCC movement, how have you seen that navigated successfully when things might have blurred a bit? And or how have you seen these things navigated unsuccessfully when things have been blurred a bit? You can pick whichever you'd like first.
Probably wanted to ask that question just so you could stop talking for a few minutes, because there's like about 7 hours worth of answers to those questions.
Thank you.
So the first thing I want to say is, and maybe this goes without saying, but I think too often it isn't, which is that everything in concept is sort of the way it is, but everybody has different board sizes, different staff, different strengths and weaknesses, different strengths and weaknesses of the executive director or the CEO, as well as board chairs and board members. And a lot of those things, size of the board, those things really do change some of this. But we'll just talk sort of conceptually about what it is. So conceptually, what Alicia said is exactly right. You've got one job. Your job is the hiring and engagement and management of the CEO. In actuality, it's more, right? You're going to board meetings. You're not just discussing the performance of the CEO. You're discussing other things. I think it's something that's in your control as a board member, but not in your control at all, is really, there's such an important relationship between the board chair and the CEO or the executive director. And because the God's honest truth is that the way the communication line should happen is that board members communicate with the board chair and staff people communicate with the CEO. And it doesn't mean there's never anything in the middle, but really the lines up are the lines up. And so what happens is that because those two relationships at the very top are so vitally important, because if you're communicating up this way and you're communicating up this way and these two people are not good together, it makes for very difficult to run a successful board and to really be effective as a board member. And I guess you see this nowhere more than in COVID. Alicia, to your point, COVID was in the JCC movement decimating. You went from having to having what, most JCCs run a zero net gain, right? They run like a zero sum budget. So you have equal expenses and equal revenue. Not all do that, but that's sort of the goal. And then all of a sudden you went to only expenses and no revenue. And if you think about the fact that, you do have fiduciary responsibilities as a board member, it was a very, very difficult road to haul. But I think the most successful relationships were where, again, this team worked together. And yes, the lines got very blurry. You didn't have staff. You had people. I don't need to tell you all what the work was like during that time period. It was on the CEOs and the EDs like nothing else, because they're the staff people, and frequently they couldn't be in their buildings. Their staff couldn't be in their buildings. It was difficult all the way around until we all figured out the Zoom world and how it was going to work and who was responsible for what. There were plenty of examples where it didn't work and it wasn't good. And then there were plenty of examples where it was good. Sadly, I will say that it is my humble opinion that where it worked was where there was a lot of PPP money. So if your CEO or ED had a good relationship with the bank and you were able to access that early PPP money, it took the financial pressure off so that people could all take a step back and make decisions. And look, I will tell you something else. At the JCC Association, which is the national level, they did an amazing job of producing connectivity for the CEOs and the EDs, so they could talk to their peers in the field and say, oh my God, CDC guidelines, are you opening camp? Are you not opening camp? What are you doing in early childhood? How many people are in your building? The kinds of things that a board chair cannot and should not be weighing in on, because that's not their job. And then there were places where, CEOs said, I'm out, like can't do this. And so the board chair became the CEO. There were many, many situations. And I'm not sure that it was just the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think that the people who navigated it best really have open and honest relationships and were respectful of the fact that it was difficult for everyone involved.
Yeah, so I want to, as my colleague says, double click on that piece of it. I think that COVID, and I know that we keep going back to this, but it really was, if there was any schism or chasm or crack or fracture, it just accelerated everything. And I think even though, I agree that the JCC movement probably got hit harder than almost any movement, and because of the various income streams, right? If you think about it, it hit philanthropy, it hit earned revenue, it hit tuition, it hit all of those things, right? So even the most diversified income stream was challenged at every level, and there are facilities, don't forget that. But I think what I saw from that is the boards that did well, and the board chairs and CEOs specifically that did well, had really built and took the time, to what you control, right? Built trusting relationships and before COVID actually hit, which meant open and honest communication. And I think the thing that I always iterate or reiterate here, which not everyone agrees with, frankly, so I'm happy to hear some pushback if people disagree, is that you actually have to form real relationships with people, meaning that for you to build trusts, right, you actually have to fully understand the person to a degree. And if you think about a working relationship and you're working in a team, wherever that is, whether it's a volunteer team or in a work environment, a professional environment, think how much team building people do now, right? For any of us who have, families or think about what your kids do in terms of team building and trust building. And that isn't something that just exists. And so some of the things that I recommend more specifically, and we'll get to sort of more talkless or straight talk, right, as we go, is if you are the board chair of an organization, or you are the CEO of an organization, or someone in that position of a committee chair and a staffer, or whatever that might look like, to the extent you communicate, spend time actually learning about each other. Right? If someone says, how is your oldest daughter who's living in Dublin? I actually understand they've taken the time to get to know me a little bit. Right. And you form natural connections, and we're human beings. And I think that's something that if we take the time to build those connections, both with respect to the staff, the CEO and the board chair, but then also what I would say is on the board itself. Right. I mean, how many boards do people sit on or they've been a part of where you look around and it's like you're literally Zoom screens that come together once a quarter? I mean, we can do a lot of things, but it's very hard to build authentic, meaningful relationships if you are once a quarter on Zoom, if you don't actually spend the time to do it. And so consequently, if we're disagreeing about something, right, how am I going to trust Lisie's judgment if I don't know her any more than a Zoom square? I'm not going to trust her judgment, right? And in difficult times, right, I have to be able to trust her judgment. That's the point of it, right? We're dealing with real life challenges and really, the last 2 years, amazingly difficult challenges. That's just something I think it's often short shrift. But I think it's something that I would really.
Alicia, I just also want to add one thing, which is one thing that's really helpful to have that not everybody has, and whether you either have it or you don't, is insight. It is really important to understand your own strengths and weaknesses, and instead of being afraid of sort of putting out into the universe what your weaknesses are, it's really important, because then you can help compensate for them and use your strengths. And it's both sides. As a human being, it's important to have that information. It is helpful in the board staff relationship if both people have that understanding, because then you can say, you know what, I'm not really so good at this. Why don't you take the point on that and I'll take the point on this, because that's really what my strength is. And to check your ego at the door, because again, I'm going to go back to this over and over again. It's not about you. It's about the organization and doing what's in the best interest of the organization. And that really is I think, an important add-on to what Alicia's saying about trust and relationship building. That is all part of it.
So just to take that question a bit further, I wholly agree that sometimes whether it's our egos or our human nature, right, that might get in the way, because we are always thinking about what might be in our own best interests, or in our kids, like JCC, our kids' best interests, or whatever that might look like. When you see that happening, how do you, especially at a staff level, it might be challenging, but at a board level, meaning a staff course correcting might be challenging. How do you as a board member help to course correct when you see people who are actually speaking not on behalf of the organization, but themselves?
Are you asking me as the board member or them as the staff people?
I'm asking you as the board member.
So how do you help navigate when people are not being their best selves?
Correct.
Well, I'll just tell you by way of example how I do it, but it's one way. It's not the only way.
Yeah.
When I was the board chair at the Bender JCC, twice a year, I would make sure that I sat down with every single board member and had coffee with them. And, gives you the opportunity to sort of be reflective and talk about what they think is good for them on the board, how their year is going board wise and what's not. There's, I think what Alicia's asking is, there's two different situations. One is a more emergent situation where you have like a hot mess happening, and the other is job. And, you have to be willing to have, as Erica Brown says, like difficult conversations. And you have to, as a leader, you have to model for people how to have them, and you have to be willing to have them. And I, my husband's very fond of saying, stick to I statements. So if you stick to I statements and not accusatory statements, I think it tends to go a little bit better. But again, it's about the organization. So if you can stick to facts based around what's not working for the organization, around the behavior or around what's happening, you probably will go further. And part of what is good about having had these twice a year coffees with people is that I knew to the board member what made them tick and why they were on the board, and therefore I could tap into what made them commit their time to this organization. And that's very helpful as a board chair to understand. And there were things like, we had a board member who, what was on his lung was on his tongue, but he had more passion for the JCC than anybody because he'd grown up there. You can't buy that. So you have to figure out, as the leader and as the board chair, how do you tap into that and how do you make that work for you and not against you?
So it's interesting because, when I talk to board chairs specifically, I always recommend, so I'll just say that they talk to their board members individually at least twice a year. Sometimes people do it more frequently, which I think can be a lot depending. But often I'll actually get, and I'm wondering if other people have suggestions here, but often CEOs will ask me, how often should I talk to all of the board members? And I think that all of them, right? Not just the board chair, not just the executive committee, but what does that relationship look like between the CEO and all of the board members? And I'm wondering how to balance that kind of board engagement, like whether or not I see both ways, whether or not you think it's important for the CEO to also have independent relationships with all the board members, or is that something that should be held more for the board chair? I think people have varying opinions. I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
First of all, absolutely, it is important. And from a governance standpoint, right, it is incumbent upon the chair, the board chair, it is board development really is in their purview. However, functionally, the CEO is there for the long haul, the board chair is not. And so while everybody has different term limits, it is in the organization's best interest for the CEO and the ED to have the relationship. However, not-for-profits, which is what most people who are on this call are involved in, they're not exactly like flooded with staff. So, let me just go spend some extra hours I don't have talking to people. So I think and also, if you've got a board of 6 people, it may be a little bit easier than if you've got a board of 40 people or 60 or even 20 people, depending on what your time is. So I think that maybe even rotationally, I'm going to focus on, there's board members that I really want to be engaged and I really want to cultivate. And so those are the people that you make time for, along with what you have to have, which are committee chairs. And you kind of rotate, everything doesn't have to happen in 1 year. And, you will get immediate feedback. You will know immediately who's engageable and who's not. And then the other thing I would add to what you're saying is it's really important for that board chair and that CEO to have conversations afterwards. Hey, guess what? I talked with this person and look what I found out, or they really are interested in this and we could do this. And so it's that, it's that constant communication. The board chair and the CEO, it sounds a little Pollyannish, but there should be like a seamlessness when it comes to the board for those two people together. So board sees a cohesive group, a cohesive duo, and that all the things can be a lot easier if that happens.
Yeah, I just want to also I agree, not surprising, but I also want to make a point that often is not made explicit, that the CEO, generally speaking, let's just be broad strokes, has fundamentally a new boss every 2 to 3 years. Right. So let's just think about that for a second. Now, yes, you do report to the whole board. And yes, the board, if if they have term limits, like does term and does churn, right, to a degree. But effectively, the person with whom that sort of, I would say, sort of boss relationship with, supervisory relationship on a day-to-day basis really changes, right? I mean, it's not day-to-day depending, right? But every 2 to 3 years. And, and working with CEOs as they're trying to get, new board chairs into the mix, it can be a challenge. So what I would just say is if you are becoming in a board chair position or you're working into a committee chair position, just think about the fact that that person who might have been there for 20 years has a ton of institutional knowledge, but consequently has to have a different type of reporting almost every 2 to 3 years and learn a different person every 2 to 3 years. Or again, depending, but I think that's just an important perspective that people often don't voice.
I could agree with Alicia more, and I just want to say that good governance would be that you should have multiple people that could be the board chair at any given time. And what's really bad governance is when you have these heir apparents and these the people who assume it's them next, because the truth of the matter is, I'm going to bring it back. It's all about the organization. And so 2 years, if you give somebody heir apparent, but you know what, guess what? Our agency had this thing happen and your skill set isn't really what we need. You need to be able to pivot. And I couldn't agree with Alicia more. It is really hard to have a new boss every 2 to 3 years, really hard. And even though the odds are by the time that person's the board chair, you've been working with them for quite a while, nobody just comes out of the blue and becomes a board chair. It is really hard. Really, it's a difficult, issue.
Okay, so I've been watching closely. We have been speaking for exactly 30 minutes to each other. And we can just as easily continue to speak 30 minutes to each other. But if anyone has, any questions, any thoughts, any additions, anything, particularly things we like when you disagree with anything that we've shared, we'd love to just open the floor at this point and see if there's any path we want to go a bit further down before I continue with whatever questions we might have.
Or any situations that you've been in
Yeah.
that you don't, you're like, how do I navigate my way out of this? Chances are we've done it. Or Alicia's definitely seen it.
Possibly, maybe.
I actually have a question. So I have to talk to an organization in December, specifically to their execs and lay leaders about power. And what I'm wondering from both of you is, what are messages that you think are important for me to share with the lay leaders and with the execs when it comes to power dynamics in the nonprofit workplace?
So in the nonprofit workplace or the boardroom?
It's an umbrella organization
Mm-hmm.
of nonprofit. So this is their annual conference when their local orgs will be coming together. So I'll be speaking directly to, we already had a session with their development staff. But this is talking to those who are holding the power. Curious what you all would think key messages should be, and also how to frame them in a way that they'll be received.
How long do you have? Lisa, you want to go first, or?
Yeah, I mean, look, for me, as a lay person, I hate these conversations because it really implies that it's okay. Like that there's clearly a problem in power dynamics, or you wouldn't be having the conversation, right? So it means that there's a problem out there. And I really believe that so many problems in this space exist because people forget that it's all about the organization, stupid. Like if you are serving on a board, let's assume it's not all ego driven, right? You're giving your time, you're giving your treasure, you're giving your talent, assuming you have all three. And, you're choosing to do it because the mission touches you. the organization touches you in some way. You have a choice as a layperson as to where you spend your time and your efforts and your money. And I think that empathy is the greatest emotion as a board member that you can bring to a boardroom. Because if you just try to step into somebody else's shoes, whether it's the board member who's frustrated because their staff person or the staff person who's frustrated, if you can just step outside of yourself for a moment and try and understand the other person's point of view, and remember it's about the organization and not about either of you, the power dynamics become less of an issue, because you really can say what is in the best interest of the organization to move it forward. Because I think that's the mutual goal for everybody, is how do I move this organization forward?
Yeah, I agree. I think continuing to put the organization's work forward is critical to really any engagement in this work. What I would say, what I would add to that in terms of power specifically is first recognizing, right? The first thing is recognizing the variety of power dynamics in the room. That can have to do with staff, board, funder power dynamics. That can do with gender dynamics. That can do with race dynamics. It can do with age. There's a whole, and I think when we think of power, people have their own way of perceiving what it is and who has it and who doesn't. And they come into that space with those, right? People have power because they have money, or they don't, right? People have power because they're white or they're not. People have power because they're women or they're not, like whatever that looks like. And I think we have a couple of alums in the room, shout out, right? Victoria and Naomi, who did the Board Member Institute, which is our flagship development program. And we actually started, coincidentally, our entire institute this time, sorry, Victoria and Naomi, we didn't get it the last time, but we got it this time, talking about power and inclusion and belonging and identity and the relationship between all of these. And they're all related. And I think there were people who came up to me afterwards and was like, this is totally irrelevant to me. And I said, really? How is that? Right? I mean, someone actually said that out loud and they're like, you're Jewish and you live in America. I don't understand how you're saying that. Did you watch Saturday Night Live? Like, I mean, like, that's like, it was very interesting to see how some people just did not think it applied to them because of their experience, because of the lens through which they view power, right? So I think the first message is it's always in the room. There are always people who have it and people who don't. Who has it may or may not be obvious, right? And that generally speaking, people are striving to get more of it in one way, shape, or form. Why is a different question, right? But more in one way, shape, or form. So I think that's what I would raise, and just to keep your mind open and understanding that usually when you're having these complicated dynamics in a room, it's about who may or may not have power at that point in time. Now, power is a loaded word. Voice, airtime, confidence, respect, right? They're not the same, but they're how they're manifest. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. I took a lot of notes. Please raise your hand, drop it in the chat. I saw that, Shira, if I could call you out, you actually posted something. I don't know if you intended it as a question, but I thought it was an interesting conversation. You said you're now making a decision between a couple of potential board positions. So I wonder, how do you decide which board to choose? What do you look for when you're making that decision to devote potentially years of your life to an organization?
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to speak to that. You know, I come from working in nonprofits, working closely with boards, and I've been invited to sit on various boards for just my roles in the community. And part of it, this is really helpful. I'm curious, to hear more about cultures of board. And that's really what I take into consideration is coming as a guest to some of the meetings and seeing how everyone is listening and hearing one another and engaging and what the goals are. And so that's part of my consideration. Of course, always wanting to be part of the Jewish community, but also one of my passions is maternal child health. So really moving that forward in terms of addressing inequities as well. So really, this is just helpful just to get more of a landscape, because I haven't really had a board 101 conversation with anyone. But I've been asked if I would consider participating in boards. Another piece too that I also consider is the fundraising piece, and how much responsibility that entails, both personally and in terms of outreach efforts.
Shira, thank you. And Netta, I'm looking at your question as well. I don't want to ignore it, but I do love the books that are on behind you on your shelf, because that means you're sitting in a nursery. Look, it would be ignorant to say that fundraising or giving is not a part of the not-for-profit board work. It is. I mean, it just is. But the one thing I can say is that you can never go wrong asking the board chair to meet you, to have a conversation. Jackie said the first responsibility of a board chair is to find your successor, and that she asked her director what was involved in the role. Having information, go back to Meredith, that gives you power. You are then making an informed decision about what appeals to you, what doesn't appeal to you. And like I said about insight before, it's not just insight about you. You get information about the organization that you're trying to help or not help. I hope that's helpful. And then Netta, the relationship between senior staff and the board, a lot of it comes down to the examples that are set for you by your CEO and for the board chair to the board members too. There are definitely going to be, this is Meredith, to your point about power. Like, to me, this is really a place where it gets a little toxic, when CEOs will not allow their senior staff to engage with board members, or where board chair says, I don't want you communicating with. It's a toxic environment. It's just not good. Why? Like, what are you afraid it is I'm going to say to you? And having lived through that situation, I would say that when that happens, when you hear those words, you should run for the hills, because there's something somebody's hiding and they don't want you to know. And that's why they don't want you to do it. And it just goes back to having open and honest conversations. And if you're a staff person, you have that conversation with the CEO. And if you're a board person, you have it with your board chair, and you say, what gives? This is not a highly functioning board if I can't talk to this person or that person, or there's whatever. It's one thing if they're like overly obsessed with governance, but that's generally not the case. As Alicia, I think, will agree with me, there's just like woefully too little really good governance in the board world. So
I mean, that's a whole nother masterclass, right? Yeah. So I would add a couple of things. I think the first thing I would say is, as it has to do with some of the fundraising pieces, I think, look, I teach a session called sort of future-oriented governance, and this is a lot of the conversations we have around fundraising are interesting. I think, and people disagree, right, as to what the fundraising requirements may not be in the board from 5, 7, 10 years from now. The one thing I want to go back to for a second is, why do we have we'll do this. Why do we have a fundraising requirement on boards historically? Does anyone know? This goes back to like the original inception of like the patron board.
Support the organization, show your commitment,
Yeah.
and encourage your family and colleagues and community to also support that organization.
Yes, very good. So the traditional model, right, yes, of support, right, is going back to what we would call the patron model. So if you've heard of like art patrons and things of that nature, that is how our boards were originally fashioned. And so consequently, there are the two responsibilities of the board, right, that we talked about. One explicitly, right, now I'm doing the teaching in between the questions thing, right, see how it goes. One explicitly, right, is the CEO piece. The second is, and I'll say it slowly, to maintain the viability of the organization to meet its unique mission. The key word is viability and mission in that sentence. And traditionally, the way that it had been done was for the board or whoever was assembled there to be the primary people who were responsible, right? In some circumstances. So that's kind of the way in which this evolved. There are now 5 to 6 different types of governance that I won't get into because it's a 2-hour class, but some of them actually don't necessarily involve fundraising, right? But they do involve time, effort, energy, right? All of those types of things. But there are other ways in which that organization focuses on raising money. That is not the norm at this point in time. So I do think that there will be people who will look at those models and think about what those look like. If you ask me, and this is me, this is not leading edge speaking, but this is me, I do think it is important that every board member contribute something to the organization, because it does show, right, your belief in the organization. How you do that in a way that's equitable, how you do it in a way where you can draw on all talent, how you do that in a way that's accessible is very complicated. And we can, if anyone wants to talk about that offline, there are lots of ways that people are thinking about it. But I just want to put that out there. I do not think fundraising is going anywhere at this point, but how to make that more equitable and accessible for people. Yeah, see, that's a whole thing. Like, what are best practices in terms of
I
equity?
want to jump in for 1 second because I see.
Yeah, go ahead, Lisie. No, go ahead. And like, Lisie and I may not
Susan-
agree on this, by the way, but go
Well,
ahead.
yeah, but Susan mentioned the words financial, like she wanted something to be transparent. I believe in transparency for lots of things when it comes to board. And I think that the less transparent you are, the more trouble you're going to get into. I agree with Alicia that I don't think fundraising is going anywhere, but Meredith, when you say, how can you ask others to give if you don't demonstrate philanthropic leadership? I think there need to be people on every board that are giving to the point where, yes, you're right. It's very hard to ask for big gifts if you're not making big gifts. But I also believe that as long as you are transparent when you're bringing somebody on the board, it may be that you're going to bring a board member on that has amazing HR experience, and that is what your board, that is what your organization needs at the moment. Just be clear that they're not going to be your big giver. As long as the board understands it. Too many times I believe that this is a whole to Alicia's point, like a whole subsection. The whole nominating committee process, and from a governance standpoint, we got to pull way out of the dark ages. That needs to be far more transparent. Why are you bringing people on the board? Because, by the way, the whole board would probably agree if there's a weakness in the organization that you're bringing on a board member that can't give, and they can't give because they're going to provide a service or a strength or whatever. So I think that as the transparency is really important, and understanding what the needs of the organization are help when you are bringing people on. And look, what are best practices for board giving? Transparency. If you have a $5,000 a year ask, because that's what you request, that's what your board governance, that's what your bylaws say, just say it's I think where it gets bad is when you don't know what it is and you're like, well, I don't know, I have to give, it's just determine what the correct policy is for your organization and be sure people know about that. Susan has her hand up.
I would like to be able to agree with you, Lise, but when you apply for grants, it really is helpful to show that you have 100% of your board behind you. And so either you're specific about what the numeric amount is to join the board, but you could have a minimum, let's say it's $100 or something, but yeah. So that's my comment.
She said the same thing. Having 100% board participation is very important for lots of grants and lots of foundations and stuff. But what that is up for discussion.
So I'm going to say something, Susan, that I am trying to work with funders to have that not be the only question they ask.
Right.
Because that is
especially the first question.
Because I have seen boards where someone literally gives $1. And I'm not saying it's because that's what they can afford. That's a different question. Or I'm sorry, that's because I can't judge what people's disposable income is. But they give it so they can answer that question. that question in my mind is not indicative of board engagement. So I actually am trying to get funders to ask different questions, which all of you I'm sure will be happy about one day, but to ask different questions to think about what it means to have an engaged board. Now, the way I've seen it done too, you know, this is again, there's more to be said here on how you think about this from an equity perspective and with an equity lens, right? Is how would you navigate asks for any funders? It would be a conversation, right? You would have a conversation. And so how I like to think through it, and again, this is Alicia Oberman, speaking for Alicia Oberman, right? If you want to think about it and you want it to like to lower barriers to entry, you can say something to the extent of like, you want a meaningful contribution to them, the top 3, whatever, however you want to say the top 3 philanthropies, and then sit down and say, what works for you? Now, what I will tell you, what I have found is that the opposite is often true, which is people leave money on the quote unquote table because their threshold, they can give more than actually the board gift. So if you actually have an individual conversation with people, sometimes you're surprised at the fact that they aren't giving at their capacity, right? So what I tend to say, and again, this is a vast generalization because I want to say building, this is very much an art, not a science, is the sort of colloquialism is time, talent, treasure. You need 2 of the 3. Right? Or like you need at least 2 of the 3 to, or something, or act, whatever that might look like, because everyone needs to be on the board. Also, the other piece I'll say is for more than one reason.
We used to say work, wisdom, and wealth.
Yes. And I would say you need 2 of the 3, right? You're not necessarily going to get all 3 all the time, but you really do need the workers.
Yes, you do.
Right? You for sure need the wisdom. And then, yes, in our current iterations, in many cases, you also need access to networks, et cetera.
I just want to
go ahead.
We're having like multiple conversations here, and
no, you're right.
God's honest truth is that board development is one piece of this. What your organization's fundraising strategy is a piece of this too. And you get as a board to decide, is your fundraising strategy going to be the board? Is that where most of your fundraising is going to come from? Is that where, you know, so, and there's also sort of a governance and an onboarding and board composition conversation, and they're all intertwined. But I would argue that if you have a clear fundraising strategy for your organization, it will become clear who should be on your board and who should be giving. And maybe they're not the same people, because a lot of times, by the way, people that write really big checks have zero interest in sitting on your board. They don't want it. They don't want the commitment. They don't want the time. They're happy to write you a check. So I think having a clear development strategy is helpful in these conversations.
Thank you for bringing us back to one. So one conversation. Any other questions? I'm trying to just go through the chat to see if there's anything else we did not get to.
Susie, I think Susan.
Susie, did you have something?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm thinking about on this too is that I have been serving on a couple of boards, which are legacy boards, you know, legacy organizations, national Jewish organizations, where it's time, where when I at 70 am at a point where you need to be replacing people like me with others, and I'm nowhere near. I'm like the average age versus the what would be the best age. Let's put it that way. And so it's really a question about how do you both as a board member sort of start moving back, extricating yourself from some of these things. And then also find other places or ways to be involved with the organizations that you care about.
Can I go first? Because I am actually quite passionate on this topic, because I
yes.
think,
go ahead.
Especially in the Jewish world, we do ourselves a huge disservice. Term limits are good governance, period, end of sentence. And we're all fond of, well, if you're serving on the executive committee, then you get recalculates again and you start from year one, and there's 7,000 ways around that. And I really believe that this comes from organizational fear. Fear of losing either institutional knowledge, fear of losing donors, fear of losing whatever. I really do believe that it is a combination of incumbency on the CEO and the board chair, current and past, to figure out how to maintain connectivity to people that step off your board. Just because they're not on your board doesn't mean they're connected to your mission, your movement, or anything else. And we have, like at JCC Association, we finally instituted a good set of term limits, and we rotate people off, and they're all invited, come to board meetings, and they do. Or they sit on committees because they've got a lot of knowledge in one thing, but it requires effort and really good governance, and it requires somebody to be focused on it. But it also, Susie, I mean, you have insight. That's what I said before. If you have insight, you know what organizations are important to you, and you also know when it's time to say, you know what, I need to make room. And there's so much hand wringing going on in the board world about how do we get new board members? How do we get new people? They're not engaging. They're not this. You are connected to mission. How do you connect those coming behind you to that mission as well? And what more purpose can you do than to make sure that the organization that you've committed to and been with for so long continues to thrive by helping them do that? Sit on your governance committee, sit on your nominating committee. Those kinds of things help with making sure that there's continuity.
Yeah, and I mean, that's true. I don't have much to add on that. I will jump in quickly on the question about the give or get. I know we're circling back, but I'm just trying to think through look through the chat because I know we're coming up on time. Again, this goes to the give or get, like whether or not it has to do again with how you are, what your overall fundraising strategy is. I think that, you know, I still think, right, like some level of contribution, again, it could be modest, like very modest is great. For each board member is important. The get is the challenge too, because some people have access to networks of people who can get, give, and others do not, right? So I think some people make the mistake of substituting the give or get with making things, again, either more equitable or accessible. But if you can't give $1,000, you may not be able to get $1,000, right? So I think that that's just something to keep in mind, that that's an imperfect quote solution to some things that people are trying to solve for. So I would think about how it's being used and the reason it's being used before people just put it out there, because I think unfortunately it's an imperfect solution to a much larger challenge.
I could not agree with you more. And I think give or get gets a little dicey out, when it's out there for a long time. Well, this person came on the board and they were just getting, and then they can give, and then it requires you to keep track. I think it's a very imperfect solution. I don't mean to take away from what getting is, because it definitely is important. But I think in terms of a board, from a governance standpoint, it gets a little dicey and slippery. It's like a slippery slope, I think.
So I will jump in. There's another question here about emeritus boards. I want to say two things about emeritus boards. I'll be blunt because it's almost at the end. Please don't call it a board.
Emeritus.
Because it just confuses everyone.
What's a better word? I totally agree.
Circle. I don't care. I'm not creative. I'm a lawyer, right?
We
Right.
called ours the Women's Emeritus Advisory Council.
As long as there is zero confusion, Hillel has a governor's board and a board. Like, not to sort of on Hillel, but like everyone is like, I'm on the board, and then you're like, you never know which board it is they're talking about. Nor do they sometimes. So what I would say is it's very simple. Please don't call it a board. The second thing I would say is just realize as a staff person, and we have 3 minutes. As a staff person, if you do create another body, that body has to be staffed, right? So that's the other piece to think about. So if you're creating another entity of some sort, one, how are you going to staff it? Why do you have it? Be very clear on why you have it. and be very clear about what you want from them and what they want from you. Because otherwise you're going to get, I mean, that I have more to say on that, but people get in trouble when they create things just to create things. And then at the end of the day, they try and get rid of them. And then that can be a challenge. So Lisie, we'll give you the last word on that.
The last word on that is that don't do it and then just call them and ask them for money. Have a plan to how to engage them and how to make sure they feel that they are making meaningful contributions, because too often they just become, oh, well, that person was a board chair 20 years ago. Why aren't they giving, blah, blah, blah money? Have you engaged them? Have you had conversations with them? Do they know what's going on in your organization? So a plan for engagement, as well as exactly what Alicia's saying. How are you staffing it? What's happening?
All right, we're at 3:58. I only say that because I always end on time. So if there's anything else, I just want to make sure there's time for it.
Another thing I love about you.
Do we have time for one more does anybody have one more question? I just want to say thank you. This has been phenomenal. I don't know about all of you, but it is this like cold, rainy day here in DC, and it is such a gift to be sitting and learning together. So Alicia and Lisie, just thank you for sharing your time and your talent and your wisdom, and thank you for being a part of JWI, and thank you and to all of you who've joined us today. Thank you, and be on the lookout for next month. I believe it's with Lisa Eisen. So check out that email coming to you, and happy Thanksgiving.